History can be tough for students to appreciate. But when we can help students understand history as a conversation, not a story, it leads to both a deeper appreciation of history and much more engaging class discussions. So how can we get students there? Podcasts. Let me tell you how. So believe it or not, it was back to school night that first really got me thinking about how to deepen my students' appreciation of history. Each year on this night, I'd cover the essential basics, really nothing special. I'd go through my curriculum and discuss the historical thinking skills I'd want students to use, or just the bigger understandings I'd want them to learn in class. However, at the end of my presentation, some parents would come up to speak with me, and they'd say things like, "You spoke with such energy and conviction. I love history, and I'm so glad my child is in your class." And I'd think to myself, this is great. I'm sure their children will share this same passion. Of course, I then taught their children, and some shared this enthusiasm, but plenty of others had no interest whatsoever. So frustrated, I'd think to myself, what's wrong with your children? Why aren't they interested in history too? Couldn't the parents just come to class to learn? And then I'd snap out of it and realize I certainly didn't want that either. After my blaming wore off, I'd craft more developed excuses for this disconnect. I'd tell myself it's their first world history class. They're young and maybe a bit immature. Maybe they don't understand the larger world yet. If only I taught them when they were juniors and seniors as opposed to freshmen. There was always a never-ending supply of excuses I could make for why they wouldn't engage. At the end of the year, these students would give feedback and they'd say things like, "Mr. Lutz, it's good that you were such a passionate teacher because otherwise history was not for me and I would have been bored to death." Or I'd have amazing projects created where students shared all the different things they learned throughout the year. But I knew these students were always passionate about history and learning. I highly doubted that I was the Robin Williams of their Dead Poets Society. To be clear though, the majority of my students were just polite and said things like, "Thanks for a great year." And many others just wanted to quietly slip out of the door in the same way they quietly passed the time during our class each day. Ultimately, what I wanted to hear was, "Mr. Lutz, you helped change the way I think about history." After years and years of this cycle, I've had two significant personal realizations. First, we come to appreciate history more the older we get because we see the impact of the past on us and we see what changes it has brought. The influence of the past remains in conversation with our present, and it's easy to see when you're older and simply have lived more years. Secondly, I realized that if I wanted more engagement in my classroom, then my students needed to develop an appreciation for history sooner. But how do we do this? Personally speaking, I became much more interested in understanding Middle Eastern history after 9/11. And I think COVID-19 will result in students developing an appreciation for the history of pandemics. But we want our present to make sense through conversing with the past. However, the relevance of our work shouldn't have to rely on human tragedy. So we need to help students recognize the conversations inherent in all of history by providing them with more perspectives. These perspectives should certainly come from different primary sources, but they should also be found in the academic conversations among historians in the construction of our understanding of the past. It became clear to see that my passion for history was ignited by these types of conversations. For instance, I can recall camping at Gettysburg, and my grandfather and my uncle sitting with me around the campfire and discussing the events of June and July 1863, the night before we were to go to the battlefield. I was filled with such anticipation to get to the park the next day. And on that day, a tour guide took us around the battlefield and explained the Battle of Gettysburg. The day after the battlefield tour, I got to watch a reenactment at the campground, and afterwards I got to talk with the reenactors themselves. Now for 8-year-old me, this is about as real as I could have ever imagined history to be. And although all these people were never talking to each other directly about Gettysburg, their ideas were all dialoguing in my own mind, and my understanding of the battle was developed through synthesizing their ideas. But more formally, I became aware of history's conversational nature when I studied historiography in college. Now, if you're not familiar with what historiography is, think of it essentially as the history of historical writing. For some, that might sound like peak awfulness, but for me, it changed the way I thought. I studied interpretations regarding James Madison and the Bill of Rights. First, I read historians from the 19th century who stated how much of a selfless patriot Madison was in creating the Bill of Rights. Then I read 20th century historians who unpacked a complex web of motivations that Madison had for writing the Bill of Rights. I realized it wasn't just simple patriotism that prompted him to write our first 10 amendments. And this class was transformative for me because I began to see how historical interpretation could evolve over time and didn't simply stagnate on the page of a textbook. My own understanding of history and my approach to studying it would never be the same. Now, of course, getting students to that level of understanding is not so easy. Lessons in my early teaching years got students to argue different perspectives, but it always just felt like they chose sides and in doing so ignored any contradictory evidence. Ultimately, I wanted my students to recognize the basics they learned weren't inherently wrong. They were just too simplistic and led to problematic assumptions that dulled all the brilliance that can shine when the work of real historical analysis is done. But I couldn't figure out how to give this sort of approach the time that it demanded. That is until I realized the role podcasts could play in my classroom. My love of podcasts began when I started teaching world history. Podcasts were a godsend in helping me learn or relearn what I was to teach, and I loved them because they provided more granularity than a textbook. They gave me more content and more perspectives that I could then digest and transmit to my students. And let's not forget the convenience of just listening to them on car rides to and from work each day. I came to realize students would benefit from listening to podcasts too. In world history, there are so many different topics to learn about, and students often don't get time to dig deep into a particular subject of interest. My assignment gave students the ability to choose any episode from a curated list of podcasts, and they had to tell me what they learned, how it added to or challenged their previous understanding of the content, and why it was important for a general audience to hear this podcast. Podcasts then started to become part of my lessons. I had students read an article or watch a video where a particular historical argument was made. And for homework that night, they'd go home and listen to a podcast in which the narrator would present an alternative interpretation from what they had learned in class that day. Students came into class the next day and had discussions about the interpretations. Now, lessons like these resulted in my students developing their favorite or least favorite historians. You can't make that up. I had students come into class 2 years later to lament the fact that they were reading an article by an academic they had come to dislike in my class, but they relished finding the flaws in the arguments that were presented. My approach was starting to work, and I wanted to see what else I could do. So I created my own podcast several years back. The driving focus of this podcast was to give my students a narrative to the content. But as the episodes wore on, I ended up creating a new segment in the podcast called Complicating the Narrative. This segment took a topic from our text or my lessons that had been oversimplified and complicated it by presenting different interpretations to challenge our conceptions. One conception I challenged, for example, was the idea that empires were always secure and stable. In the podcast, I would discuss how this was too simplistic of an understanding by presenting academic works from historians who argued against these claims by showing all the resistance in its various forms against empires. In another episode, I referred to the works of historians who challenged Eurocentric narratives explaining why Britain was the first to industrialize. My Revolutions episode introduced my students to the argument that the Haitian Revolution had influences from Africa that have long since been ignored by history books that wanted to trace it primarily back to the European Enlightenment. Now, I have found podcasting was the route for me. It was transportable, it was relatively low-tech, given my abilities, and it opened up a whole additional chunk of time that I could devote to discussion and analysis in class. However, there are so many ways you could help students complicate the historical narrative. You might create your own brief set of YouTube videos summarizing different historical interpretations. Simply taking 5 minutes at the start of class and calling it Complicating Your Homework, where you chat about different interpretations of a particular historical development before students get to dig into the sources themselves. Maybe you pair texts in or outside of class that present two different takes on the same historical topic. With the door opened up for distance learning more than ever, maybe this is the year you have students create their own podcast to document their path towards a deeper understanding of history and the historical process. There's so many different options to help your students realize that historical interpretation is a constant work in progress. Please feel free to share other ideas you have in the comments. I really want to keep this conversation going with you all. But I now realize the best part of history is that it's always been driven at some level by someone or something adding to or complicating the historical narrative. As teachers, we must help students recognize the different voices of the past and that their voice needs to be heard in the conversation on history. Thank you.